The subject tonight being karma and reincarnation is a very complicated subject. It's complicated to teach in America because until recently these were very new concepts. Am I in the right relationship to the mic? Can you hear me clearly? Okay. Let me know if in some way it starts messing up, because there's no point in my talking if you can't hear me. I can entertain myself alone if you're going to be here. Okay. When I teach these subjects in the West, it's getting to be more understood. The idea of karma, reincarnation is even coming to be more common. These are very sensible ideas, and people are beginning to be more sensible. Plus, we're living in a time in which all the global cultures just seem to be dividing up. My American friends, my Indian friends living in America, working for a company founded by Americans who opened an Indian branch, were absolutely tickled to see their totally, I have to say the word atheistic, materialistic American bosses in India dressed in kurtas breaking coconuts for the opening of their India branch. They just were, every Indian employee was looking at the YouTube that somebody had made of it, and it was just, everything is crisscrossing. And of course, they had to participate. What else could they do? It was sort of like the revenge of all the immigrants to America finally got their revenge when their bosses came over here. But when you come to India, when I come to India and we start talking about the subject of karma, well, let me put it this way. There was a music teacher who had a student, and the student knew nothing at all, so the student was charged $10 a lesson. There was another student who came who'd had 5 years of lessons from another teacher, so the teacher charged that student $20 a lesson. Because not only was he going to have to teach him correctly, he was also going to have to undo everything that he didn't understand. Now, in the short time that I've been traveling and teaching in India, which has just been a few weeks, the question of karma comes up repeatedly, the question of fate, the question of free will, and it's always asked in a certain tone that is not the understanding of karma that was given to me through this line of gurus, through Swami Kriyananda, the direct disciple of Yogananda, from whom I learned all these teachings. So I'm offering you not my own ideas about these things. I think source really matters. I'm a mouthpiece for those wiser than myself. But through many years of practice and introspection and observation and study, I've become personally convinced as well. When the idea of reincarnation was first offered to me, it seemed a much likelier explanation than anything else I'd been offered. And I just began to live as if it were true. And over a number of years, the self-evident fact that we have endless affinities for things that we have no other relationship with. The man I'm married to, the moment I saw him, I wouldn't go so far as to say I fell instantly in love, but just the moment I saw him, it was self-evident that there was a pre-existing connection between us. And I'm sure all of you have had that experience. Now, when we come to the question of karma, which of course is inextricably tied to the question of reincarnation, the dividing line in the confusion that I find that makes karma more of a bondage than a liberating concept, the way it's too often offered to me, is what can I do? It's my karma. How can we help it? It's our karma. If it's our karma, what are we going to do? How much of everything is karma? But there's a thought form behind that, which is, yes, it explains everything that happens, but once that explanation is offered, we shrug our shoulders and there we are. Now, the essence of the path of self-realization, as Paramhansa Yogananda and these masters offered it, is exactly the opposite of passive acceptance. Now, I know this is a fine line because everyone loves the word surrender, and I also hear the word surrender a lot in relationship to a guru, in relationship to God, whatever it is that we're talking about. somehow we understand also that there's a necessity to get into right relationship to some power that's greater than our own minds. But all of these things just kind of swim around, I've seen, somewhere in our conscious and subconscious mind, and we don't actually know what to do with them. My personal motivation to get on the spiritual path was 100% the opposite of either surrender or passive acceptance. It was this extremely powerful sense that it was possible to choose your own destiny. It was possible to create your own life. And I was just chafing against the idea that somehow the society that I was looking at was the definition of the choices I had for myself. That the examples of the adults around me were the definition of my choice. I didn't see for many years an alternative to that. And as a consequence, I lived in a state of, well, I was rescued early enough, so I didn't become really mentally unbalanced. But that's what I would say I was teetering on. I mentioned last night, those of you who were here, that a book by Swami Vivekananda was the first spiritual book that was handed to me. And specifically, among the 3 or 4 phrases that changed my life, he made this simple statement. I didn't even know he was talking about karma. He just said this: everything that you are today is the result of what you did yesterday. Everything that you will be tomorrow is the result of what you're doing today. And somewhere in my soul, I knew that I could influence my reality, but no one had ever told me that I could before. And of course, the conviction of his spiritual awareness communicated in those words, and all of a sudden, I had the key, and I never looked back. I was 18 years old, and I never looked back. I just looked forward. But when I finally found Swami Kriyananda and Paramahansa Yogananda, it began to come into focus, and that's what I want to bring to you all tonight. We didn't charge you double because you already know the concept of karma, but I ask you to bear with me a little bit and just try to feel it from a different angle. It's a very confusing subject for this reason. On the one hand, we can get a theoretical understanding of the fact that we do, in fact, create our own karma, and that our lives are the result of decisions that we ourselves have made. That sounds really good until we try to make another decision and find ourselves seemingly compelled by forces that we don't seem to have any access to keep making decisions that we don't even want to make. In the position that I have been in for many years of trying to help people move forward spiritually, there's a phenomenon I've seen that I've finally begun to understand. A person will speak to me with tremendous conviction and sincerity in the moment about what they're going to do and how they're going to do it. And then, in fact, their actions, the line they will define with their words is here, but the actions they take are over here. And I myself have found myself in that exact position. I make a determination to do this, and this is the tricky part. I actually think I'm going in a straight line, but actually I end up over here. And I put complete continuous effort in this direction, but my reality has ended up off to the side. Because deep within us, and this is, I have to refer to further classes, we've actually made quite a cohesive set here. In a couple of days or somewhere in this cycle, we're going to also have a class about the chakras. So when I really get to the chakras, I'll really be more specific about this. But in a general sense, our karma is no fixed reality. I spoke of this a little last night, so you'll hear the same themes. We tend to think of things because we live in the material world and we live in a material body. Even when we're talking about subtle realities, the habit of the subconscious mind, we visualize them as fixed things. I mean, there's a chair over here, It's kind of heavy. You know, I pick it up, it has a certain shape. Even if I threw it out the window, it would more or less remain a chair. It's a fixed material reality. We tend to think about our karmic condition as if it were a fixed material reality, like a big rock. You know, rocks are really huge and really heavy. And so we just think of them in these fixed forms. At the same time, in this day and age that we live in, there has been a complete revolution in understanding even the nature of the material world. I am not a scientist, do not read scientific literature, but even I know that the physicists are telling us that even that chair does not really have the fixed reality that we think it has. It's just a pattern of energy that vibrates in a certain way that is perceived by us to be a fixed form. Now, how much more so are we dealing, but nonetheless, we still, as I was saying, we have this subconscious habit based upon the fact that we live in a physical body, we interact in a material world, that when we think about things, we think about their form being fixed. So part of what binds us and confuses us enormously when we start thinking about our karma or our karmic conditions is that we somehow visualize it as having a form and it also having what I would say is an immutable form, a form that cannot be altered. And even if we think about altering it, we always think in terms of physical strain. The suitcase that I'm carrying around India, try as I might, is still the maximum 20 kilos. I cannot seem to get it below that. And every time I lift that thing, I think, what is in it? Why am I carrying it? And I go through it again, and it's just got what I need in it. I'm here for 8 weeks, what can I do? But just moving, every time I have to move that thing, even though it's on wheels, it's a nuisance. And that is a great deal about how we feel about the attitudes that we carry, the destinies that we have, the obstacles seemingly that prevent us from shifting. Now, last night I was also speaking to you, and I'm speaking to you again. A great deal of what binds us is wrong concepts. And if we can get the concept shifted in our mind, we find that everything else follows from that. Now, when we pair karma and reincarnation, we're talking about something that follows us even when we don't have a material body. So far from karma being any kind of a physical thing, it's something even that transcends the material world that we're working in. The vehicle by which karma is transferred is the chakras. The chakras are an aspect of the astral body, not the physical body. The astral body is the pattern upon which this body is made. And what that pattern is above all is the chakras. And what the chakras represent are vibrations of consciousness somewhere on the spectrum between the lowest potential for a human being and the highest potential for a human being. Yogananda makes a very interesting statement. You know, people speculate these days because human beings don't always behave in the most uplifted way. So they look at whales and they look at kittens and they look at fish and sort of say, well, maybe these species are more advanced. You know, maybe the dolphins know more than we do. And it's interesting speculation. Yogananda put the subject to rest in a fascinating way. He said the human nervous system with the spine and the frontal lobe of the brain is uniquely capable of expanding its awareness to infinity. In other words, the human body can support infinite consciousness, whereas the nervous system of a dolphin cannot. And so the idea that the human being is the highest species is not merely sentimental or because the human beings write the books. It's because that the nervous system itself has this potential. That's why a master can incarnate in a physical body. I know there are traditions of avatars coming as a lion and a few other things. I'm just going to put those aside for the moment. I'm always a little nervous when I speak to an Indian audience because you're going to bring up something that I really have no answer for. But this is how Yogananda explained it. Okay, so this nervous system, which is the chakra system, the potential of the human consciousness is infinite. We can become self-realized. That's what we're doing here. That's what we're on our way to doing. And we're also capable, the same human beings, you see them around us, are capable of really barbaric actions that would put animals to shame. And it depends on how we have answered a few key questions. And those questions are, who am I? Am I this physical body? Am I this independent ego? Can I merely grab and take for myself without it having any consequences on anyone else? We see people in the world who are like that, don't we? They're either very dull-minded and they just don't even know anybody else is out there. I have a relative who was like that. She just never seemed to know there was anybody on the planet but her. You know, just in her point of view. It was always just her point of view about everything. She just didn't seem to know that we all had feelings too, right? I mean, she was a refined and a lovely person, but she had a little bit of a tendency just not to know there was anybody on the planet but her. And you see somebody who will murder someone or steal their money or, you know, take things from people. And surprisingly, sometimes such people don't even know the consequences of their own actions because the way they define themselves is so separated from the rest of reality that they just don't even know that. There was a man who lived near me, and at 6 in the morning, he came out to fix his car. And where he was fixing his car was not very far from my bedroom. And at 6 in the morning, he just turned his radio up full blast on a Saturday morning to fix his car. And it was so astonishingly inconsiderate that it actually didn't even annoy me. It just amused me. And I'm certain that later in his life, when somebody treats him with the same absolute inconsideration, he'll be furious. And he won't connect the dots even slightly, just because he just thinks he's a solitary being in this world and everybody else is there to please him. Now that's the lowest way we think of it. The highest way is the masters who are behind us, that we have realized our oneness with all of creation. And we can no more act in a self-serving, selfish manner than we can stop breathing. It's just, we can't do it. I mean, we take care of that which is important to us and with which we identify. So people will take care of their own children. People will take care of their aging parents. But they won't even feel any sense of responsibility necessarily for anything beyond that. The masters feel equal responsibility for every living being. They respond appropriately according to how receptive those beings are, but their sense of love and identity is all the same. Now with us, we are on a continuum of learning. We will not cease to reincarnate. We will not fulfill the destiny for which we were born until we achieve the state of consciousness of the masters. And one of the great mistakes that has crept into our understanding of self-realization over Kali Yuga during the period of intense material understanding, which Sri Yukteswar corrected that Kali Yuga is now over. We're into a higher age, which is self-evident if you look around, that the age of energy is all around us. I mean, every one of you, I am certain, is carrying a mobile phone, you know, and just we're suddenly in this interconnected reality in which space is dissolved, time is dissolved. I was in the rainforest of Costa Rica just thinking I was back in the middle of nowhere, and the guide's mobile phone rings. He pulls it out and sets his next appointment. You know, it's just everywhere. The whole world is connected, and I could stand in that rainforest and dial any place in the world, and we'd be together in that way. Well, one of the delusions that crept in when we were thinking in terms of fixed form, we forgot our actual true relationship to the Christ and the self-realized masters. We surrender to them, we worship them, we admire them, but we don't understand that they are our own destiny. And this word karma that we use all the time is actually has a really simple and interesting meaning. Your karma is the unlearned lessons, the misunderstandings that you have that stand between where your consciousness is right now and your destiny as a self-realized master. And on that spectrum that I'm describing, every action that we take, every thought that we have, every attitude, every response to life is an affirmation of reality somewhere between the lowest potential of a human being and the highest potential of a human being. And it's not about what we think, it's not about the front that we put onto the world, it's not about what we can get away with and not get arrested for, it's what we're actually vibrating. You know, when we look at one another, when you're driving on the highway and somebody starts to run into you and you become panicked for the injury to your body, when somebody speaks unkindly to you and you have an impulse to punch them in the nose thinking, how dare you talk to me like that? When somebody who is himself in pain tries to pass that pain on to you and your response is to pass it back, every one of those decisions says something about our actual state of consciousness. And every experience that comes to us, for good or for ill, has only one purpose. It's to show us where we are on that spectrum and to help us understand how to move up that spectrum. And the reason we're trying to move up the spectrum is it's really not complicated. It's because the closer we are to our true nature, the more bliss and joy and freedom we have in our lives. The farther we are away from it, the more we suffer. My youth, as I've described briefly last night and a little bit tonight, I didn't have words for it at the time, but when I got the vocabulary of self-realization, I could articulate feelings that I had then. And what I had then, I realize now, was this sense of unbearable confinement. There was no apparent confinement. I lived in a relatively privileged American home. I grew up with, you know, every opportunity that a person of my education and talent had. I could have done anything that I chose to do. But I always felt like there were these just limits imposed on me that I recognize now what you would call it was simply the confinement of being identified with my body, with my ego, with my culture, with my life, and the awareness that there was another reality that belonged to me, but I didn't know how to get it. My first and only desire that I had for a period of time until I found the spiritual path was that I would get married and that I would have children, that I would have many children. And in fact, I've never had any children, and I'll explain to you why and why that's okay. I know sometimes when Indian women ask me if I've ever had children and I say no, the next thing is sort of to pat me comfortably on the hand. It's okay. I made a conscious decision, my husband and I together. But what I wanted to do is I wanted to expand my sense of identity. And so the easiest way I could think of to do that was to make multiple me's, was more or less what I was thinking, as young girls do. You think if you just create more babies, you'll be more. But at a certain point in my life, I realized that even if I had a dozen children, it would just be 12. Now, of course, as a person who's now watched my friends raise children, I recognize that having children is very different than I was thinking about it then. That's beside the point. But I wanted to be bigger. And it was so interesting to me because that was the only desire I really had in my life. And practically the moment I met Swami Kriyananda, it went away from me. Because when I saw him, it's like this veil went away from my eyes, and I actually saw freedom. I was looking at freedom. I was looking at a consciousness that chose its own destiny. And I realized the confinement I was feeling, well, it's just exactly what I was sort of saying I didn't want to say to you. I was confined by my own karma. But the karma I'm defined by is that this is how Yogananda defines ego. He defines ego as the infinite self identified with the physical body. It's an extraordinarily subtle definition. People think of ego as a sense of importance or bragging about your talents or pushing your will on other people. Yes and no. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. Sometimes you're just behaving appropriately because you have the best idea and that's what you ought to do. But ego itself is to take that infinite freedom, which is our true nature, and instead of identifying with our true nature, we identify with this limited reality. Everything about ourselves, if you start thinking about it, originates from the fact that we identify with this body. You know, I speak of being an American. My upbringing, actually, my family was Jewish, which I often speak about. I'm of a certain age. I have one husband. All of those things are all related, when you think about it, to the fact that I identify with this body. Now, when Swami Kriyananda was talking on Sunday about Yogananda, he specifically mentioned an extremely touching incident I've heard him speak of before, at a time at the end of Yogananda's life, when he was working on his commentary on the Bhagavad Gita, and Swami Kriyananda, as a young monk, the master had invited him to be with him in order to train him in the last years of his life. And he said often when Yogananda would walk around the compound where they were, he would lean on Kriyananda's arm, not because he was an old man. You see Kriyananda leaning on the arms of the devotees now because his physical body is elderly and he can't move it easily. Yogananda was not even 60 years old. He was perfectly strong, but he would lean on Swami, and sometimes he would stumble like that. And then he looked at his disciple Kriyananda and he said, I am in so many bodies. Sometimes I forget which one I'm supposed to keep moving. And then he said, I have to ask others whether I have eaten or not. Now, that's just so interesting to contemplate, isn't it? I doubt if any one of us, when we walk out of here tonight, will forget which one of the bodies we're supposed to keep moving. It never even crosses our mind to lose touch with it, because we have committed ourselves so deeply, not only to the physical body we're in, but to all the extensions and relationships of it. And what Master Yogananda puts in front of us is to tell us that this is not inevitable, that we actually have a choice. Now, what I love about the way Swami Kriyananda teaches is that even when he gives us an idea that's just really huge, he tries to bring it down to a point where we can recognize the same principle in some everyday experience of our own life. Before I go on with karma, let me give you my favorite of his. When he is asked the question that so many people are asked, why did God create the universe? Which is the great unanswerable question, to which Vivekananda actually gave my favorite response. He said, the level of consciousness that asks the question is incapable of understanding the answer. Which I thought was a very clever way to just silence the audience, but Swami Kriyananda's was sweeter. When he was asked, he said, well, the nature of God is Satchidananda, ever conscious, ever new bliss, ever existing, ever new bliss. He said, it is the nature of happiness, it is the nature of joy, and it's certainly the nature of bliss, to want to share itself with everyone. Now, that also sounds beautiful, but then he just brought it down to the simplest thing. If after you leave this hall tonight, you're hungry, and maybe you go to a restaurant you've never been to, and you discover that it's really good, what will you do right away? Maybe even from the restaurant. You're going to pull out your mobile, aren't you? And you're going to call someone or text them and say, having dinner at a new place, think you'll like it. Because as soon as we're happy about something, it's the nature of happiness to want to expand itself, isn't it? And the wonderful thing about divine principles is they're observable all around us at all times. In fact, once Swami Kriyananda was asked, are you a happy man? Are you happy? The life that you've lived, are you happy? He responded first, he said, well, many people will say they're happy. And you look into your eyes and you're not so sure, but from their point of view, they're happy. But he said, if you have true happiness, you want to make everyone else as happy as you are. And again, because it's the nature of true happiness to want to share itself. And if you don't really want to share it with others, then what you're having is not necessarily the true happiness that we're looking for. Now, in our lives from the point of view of identifying with these bodies, let's just start in a very small family unit. If you have a family unit in which, let's say the mother or the father, let's use the mother, I'm not casting aspersions on mothers, but let's say the mother identifies more with her own interests than the interests of her children. It's difficult for children growing up in a household in which the mother's self-definition is still circumscribed by her single body. And even she's given birth to these children, but she doesn't identify with them sufficiently to include their genuine well-being in her thought form. Maybe it's the father in the household who's like that, who's more interested in using his money for his own pleasure. And he doesn't identify himself with his own children sufficiently to sacrifice his pleasure for their well-being. No sacrifice if that's how he really identifies. Maybe your neighbor, you identify more with your own home than with your neighbor, and you're going to put a big wall up that's going to spoil the view from your neighbor's apartment. But you identify more with your own self more than you do with your neighbor. Or you're willing to cut corners and be a little dishonest because it doesn't matter if they lose a little bit of money as long as I get more. It's all about where we identify. And we see people through the ages, historical figures and the people that we know in ourselves, that the degree of our expanded consciousness is defined by what we identify with, how strong the ego has a hold of us, how generous we can be. We admire those people in the world who are identifying with a much bigger reality. Now, just from a simple practical point of view, the more we identify only with our own reality, the more we're at war with the world around us all the time. Isn't that so? Because we're always having to protect ourselves from everybody else. We're always having to hoard. We're not able to take their well-being into account. Okay, this is the spectrum that I'm describing. From selfish interest to complete selflessness that isn't even selfless because there's no self there anymore, even to identify with. Now, every time we're faced with what we would call in our lives a difficulty, if you really look at it, every time, virtually every time, it's a karmic opportunity to shed a narrower definition and embrace a broader one. I am of an age now where this happens to women. When we're young, we look a certain way. When we get older, we look a certain way. I've been amazed as a yogi, as long as I've been a yogi, that I even noticed. But I did notice. It was about 10 years ago that the shift took place. And I would look in the mirror. I'll just say this to the women in the room. Because Americans wear their hair, we don't wear our hair long like some of you Indian women do. I changed my hairdresser every time I got a haircut for 5 years because I thought it was the hairdresser's fault. Because no matter how they cut my hair, I just kept looking. I never looked like I really used to look anymore. Finally, I figured out that it wasn't the haircut. That was a big moment. All women just kind of slide over into that other side. I identified with the body. I identified with a certain youth. Now, fortunately for me, it was amusing rather than really traumatic. I was astonished, as I said, that I even noticed, but I did notice. But it was amusing to me. But how many people as they age, how many women, how many men, as we begin to lose the self-definition that was based on a certain condition of the body, actually suffer. I can't do this anymore. I don't look like that anymore. Or, you know, you see women or men behaving in ways that are extremely inappropriate, age inappropriate, because they themselves are still identified with a reality that is gone from them. And they suffer because of that. Or where we have a certain role raising small children, then the children grow up and they're not grateful for what we've done for them. And the idea we had of our happy home, what we have identified with, what we have defined as the conditions of our happiness. The first question I said is, who am I? The second question is, where does my happiness really come from? And unlearned karmic lessons are to say anything other than my happiness comes from Ananda, from my relationship to the infinite. This is how the masters, Jesus being the most famous example of someone whose life ended in a way that is perceived by the world as enormous suffering, but he didn't suffer. He suffered only because the message of salvation that he was bringing was rejected by those to whom he had brought it. That caused enormous pain to his heart because he knew what the consequences would be, that they would have to go on for many more incarnations. But he didn't identify with that physical body enough to care what happened to it. Now, all of us, you know, Swami Kriyananda tells us this story. He tells it to us all the time. We never like to hear it, and he always tells it to us. He tells us that when he goes to the dentist, he never takes Novocaine. He never takes any painkillers when he has work done on his teeth. I mean, he has a root canal done. He has oral surgery without any painkillers. Now, first of all, he can sit still enough while they're working on him. And he dismisses the difficulty of it very lightly. He says, well, I just concentrate on something else. You know, I identify with the book that I'm writing, and so I work out the thoughts in my mind. I work out melodies that I'm writing. Now, the reason that all of us, if you have dental work or you have dental work, I can watch fairly passively because I don't identify with your body like I identify with mine. There's a story of Ramakrishna that's always so touching. There was a cook in the ashram who became angry at a cat and picked up a stick and chased the cat out of the kitchen and you know, really struck the cat very hard. Then later he came into where Ramakrishna was, and Ramakrishna had welts on his back. And that devotee became very upset. Who did this to you, master? And I will take my revenge on him. And Ramakrishna said, well, actually it was you. He said, when you struck that cat, you know, I took it on my own body. Now, again, you know, that's a very high state of consciousness. But in our own lives, if we see someone being hurt and we feel the compassion, even just the sense of caring sufficiently to either intervene and help or even send a blessing toward that person, it's not always appropriate to intervene. I'll talk about relationships later in this week. I was in the car and I saw two people just having a fight on the street. There was no possibility of my actually getting out of the car. I didn't even speak the language they were speaking. It just wasn't appropriate. But you feel it and you send a blessing to them. You ask God to intervene if he can. You don't just think, oh, that doesn't have anything to do with me. You know, if the cat is being struck, it appears on the back of the master. Now, we would think that the more we would identify with, the more pain we would have. But in fact, when we begin to understand where does my happiness come from, it comes from defining myself more and more according to this unchanging inner reality. Now, of course, this becomes the incentive for meditation, for prayer, for satsang, for all the tools of right living, which make this whole system work. If we just casually say, well, I need to identify with a greater reality, but then just go on living our lives in exactly the same way, then of course nothing changes. But what we have to understand is this is all energy. This is all habits, attitudes that are just registered in the chakra at a certain level. And the more we put energy into a higher reality, and that means every time there's a challenge, which is our karma that comes to us, how we respond to it is the answer to what happens next. Because if we take the challenges of our life and keep affirming a smaller and smaller and more limited identity, the power of the infinite is going to have to keep pounding on us, because we are inevitably need to be drawn out of that. If, when challenges come to us, we recognize this is just a challenge to my self-identity. Maybe I'm losing a loved one at this point. Maybe someone very close to me has died. Maybe I now have to live without that person in my life. Prior to this time, I defined myself as someone who had that person in my life. And now the course of my karma has taken that person away from me, not so that I will suffer, but so that I will realize that even now the same Satchidananda is my potential. I have to free myself from all limiting conditions to my ability to experience that happiness, you see? The confinement and the suffering that we have is because we say, I can only be happy if these conditions are met. The truth of our nature is that bliss is our nature no matter what conditions we're living under. Now, as I said to you last night, this is very challenging. And this is also not something that we can just turn to in a second. But once we begin to understand, this is not my karma in the sense that this is my inevitable, impossible destiny. This is my opportunity to be confronted with some condition that I have placed on my own happiness, that now you can say God if you like, you can say Guru if you like, you could even say my own superconsciousness is not content to leave me in that condition, so he's going to take it away from me and give me the opportunity to expand to a greater reality. I'll give you a story of a woman friend of mine. She came to our retreat in California when I was on the staff there. She came all the way from Sweden to California. She told me that she had been extremely blessed at birth to have a very dear friend incarnate as her sister. And they were very close in age, and they just grew up in absolute attunement with each other. They had their whole lives planned out. You know, they would get married, they would live close to each other, they would raise their children together. Everything about her life was defined by this really beautiful friendship she had with her sister. Before very much of that could manifest, the sister was diagnosed with cancer, and despite all efforts to save her, she died. So all of a sudden, this woman, who was in her mid-20s, I believe, when I met her, just everything about how she'd identified her life, she felt had just been pulled out from under her. She honestly said that when her sister died, it's just like her whole capacity even to function virtually just came to a halt. But it disrupted her life to such an extent that she said she had to pray and dig deep within herself to find even the will to go on. She said with the power that she would never have put forth if the challenge to her had not been so intense. As a consequence, she discovered levels of her own consciousness, and she felt a response from God that she had never imagined was there. As a result, she read Autobiography of a Yogi. As a result, she began to practice meditation. She came to California to learn Kriya. And everything in her life had just turned in a completely new, and she could see much more dynamic direction that had a potential that the other life she imagined had never had. So I'm talking to her, and I took a chance. I said, well, given all that's happened to you, would you call your sister's death a tragedy? And she was honest enough not to answer quickly, and she said, I don't see how I could. She said, my sister loved me and she died, and as a result of her death, she said, all these wonderful things have now come into my life. And she sort of said, I don't know what to call it. Now, if in fact the karma of her sister dying had caused her to contract from life and identify now, first I identified as this lucky person with this wonderful sister, now I identify as a person who must remain miserable because that condition of my life has been taken away, who does not have the strength or the imagination to imagine a life other than the one I've already identified with, now that would be a tragedy. But only for a few incarnations. But because when the opportunity to expand is given to us, if we contract instead, that's when we go backwards. This world should be different than than it is. But if with every opportunity we say, yes, this is my karma, this is my wonderful karma, I get to be bigger than I thought I could be, and often I get to be bigger than I ever wanted to be. A lot of times I write to my friends when they're in a difficult time, well, God is taking an unwelcome interest in your spiritual growth, isn't he? You know? Because it's perfectly fair to complain. I remember once my husband came home and gave me the news that I was going to have this certain job assignment that I really didn't want, and I was so annoyed. I was just so annoyed about it that he began to try to, sort of placate me and promise me that maybe I could get out of it. I said, no, if I could get out of it, I wouldn't be so annoyed. The fact is, I realize I have to face into this. This is something I really have to do. Once we begin to understand that no matter how difficult it is, there's always going to be a freedom on the other side of it, because the very difficulty, you see, is the definition of your confinement. A dear friend of mine also died. If you live long enough, a lot of your friends die, everybody dies. She had cancer also. She died about the age of 50. She had a beautiful husband, 2 beautiful children. They were extremely well-to-do. She had a gorgeous home, everything. She became ill. She managed to take treatments and live a number of years longer than the doctors thought she would. But it was inevitable that cycle of disease was going to take her. Everybody else knew it. But finally, there was nothing more the doctors could do, and just by intuition, I went to her house that very day without even knowing why I was going. And it was the day that the doctor had said there's nothing more we could do. And she was crying. She was weeping more than crying. She was weeping, and she said, I know it sounds silly, she said, but I actually thought I was going to get well. She says, I can see now that there was never really a chance. But then she kind of gestured to the whole home and the pictures of the family, and she said to me, she said, how can I leave all this? I mean, her whole sense of her happiness was her husband, her home, her beautiful children, everything. She also loved God very deeply, but there was a big fight going on. I said to her, when the time comes, I said, the light will come into you, and in that light you will find everything you think you are finding here. You will realize that everything that you're enjoying here is only a manifestation of that light. And when you come to that, you'll realize that you're losing nothing, and even those you're leaving behind are losing nothing. I said, but between now and that moment, I said, there's a wall of tears. And There's no reason to think that it can be otherwise. You know, you just have to see that this is a gigantic shift and that it's not what you asked for. And so she cried, I cried. I'm about to cry here too, just even thinking about it. And time passed, and she came into her last days, and they called me when she was close to the end, and I went to be with her. And by that point, she was just lying in bed, and her beautiful family and her beautiful home were there. She looked up at me. All she said was, "You were right," just like that. "You were right," because the light had begun to just take away all the rest of it. "You were right," she said. And just with this beatific smile on her face, she just looked at all of us and just said, "Goodbye," like that. And then she stopped speaking. And 24 hours later, she breathed her last. Now, on one hand, it was, you would call it, it was tragic. Children lost their mother early, all those things. But on the other hand, it was a karmic opportunity for everyone. Reincarnation is very reassuring in all of this. It's not the first time we do this. It's not the first time we're separated. It's not the first time we're challenged. It's not the last time we'll see each other. It's not the last time we get to play these roles out. The more and more we expand our hearts, and in response to God's call, instead of saying, "No, no, no." One of my friends, her little boy, very strong-willed, and he had a big tantrum about something, and they had their agreement, and she picked him up and put him in his room and closed him in his room. And he was screaming in there. Then it got quiet, and she opened the door. She said, "Honey, are you done?" And he sort of looked up like this, and he said, "Not quite, Mommy." And then she shut the door, and he screamed and banged the floor for a little while longer. And then he was done. Sometimes I really feel like that with Divine Mother. "Are you done?" "Not quite, Mommy." And, I'm going to have to suffer a little bit longer. I'm going to have to rebel a little bit longer. I'm going to have to impose my own narrow perception of where my happiness comes from for a little bit longer. But when I'm done with my tantrum, open the door. Show me where I really belong. When that woman died, I didn't have the spiritual vision to go with her, but I could feel where she was going. When my father died, and my father was not a spiritually aware person, but he was a good man. My sister and my brother and I were there. We knew he was passing. He was in his 80s. And when someone is dying, I don't know how many of you have had the opportunity to sit with them. Death is so beautiful in a certain way. At first, when someone is in the last hours, they struggle to take air in. And so they breathe like this, like that. If you're doing a vigil with someone dying, there'll be a point in which the struggle will be to breathe out. And as soon as you hear that, you know that they're very close to leaving their bodies. Because, of course, when we're born, we take that first breath in. And no matter how perfect the child, until that child breathes in, there's no certainty that the child will live. They say astrologically, you probably know this, that that's actually the beginning of the incarnation. Master says, the reason the baby cries is because it realizes that it's really out of the astral world and it's here again. That first breath, it's committed. And then there's the last breath, just the last time. So I was sitting with my father, and my sister had gone away for a while, and then it shifted, and all of a sudden he was going like that. Then there would be a pause, and then he'd take a short inhalation and a long exhalation. All the force would be trying to blow the breath out. And I called her. I said, "You have to get over here quickly because he's going to go very soon." And she came, and within the hour. But when I was just sitting there, and that last breath went out of him, I felt this rising joy, just extraordinary sense of joy. My father had been diminished. He'd been diminished mentally. My mother had died a couple of years earlier, and I don't know where he went because I couldn't see it, but wherever it was, it certainly made him happy. And I was so happy with him, I think is the only way I can say it. he was in a place where people were caring for him, and many people had cared for him, and I don't know, they all felt they had to cry. He was an 85-year-old man who'd had a fine life, and now so they all had to be sad. My sister was more sensitive than I. I had this ear-to-ear grin on my face, and these people would come in and they would commiserate with us, and I would just be laughing. Finally, she punched me in the ribs and just said, you know, you're just behaving in a way that's incomprehensible to them. She was with me, so I just sort of moved off into the corner and let her sort of deal with everyone, because I couldn't feel anything except his freedom. Now, even when it's not death that we're dealing with, even when we're dealing with someone who may be struggling and suffering, Swami Kriyananda said something to me that is so exquisite. It's just transformed my way of relating to unhappiness in others. Swamiji said, when he sees someone who's sad, and God knows in this world, it's a get away from my ocean of suffering is how Master put it and how Krishna put it. Get away from my ocean of suffering. You see it everywhere, because everybody wants to stay where they are and not go where we're trying to go. But he said, when I see someone who's sad, Swamiji said, all I can think of is how much sweeter will be the bliss when they finally realize God's presence even in the midst of that suffering. Because the end of the story for all of us is perfect resolution and joy. That's what all the masters promise, and that's what we ourselves find whenever we rise to the occasion. I said to my friend from Sweden, was your sister's death really a tragedy? What would you call it? I said to my friend dying of cancer, you think you can't, but when the light comes, you will realize it's all as it should be. And it's all the sweeter for our having had to go through that to get there. Does that take courage? Mm-hmm, sure does. It's one of our classes, how to have courage. But you see, it's the only place to go, because what is the alternative? That we just have a tantrum from now until when? How many incarnations? Divine Mother opens the door and says, are you done yet? Not quite. Okay. I'll just keep insisting that I want things a certain way and I refuse to be happy unless they're that way. And Divine Mother says, are you done yet? Okay, not yet. Who suffers? And how long do we want to suffer? That's why the masters come and they just bliss through everything. Unimaginable until even the smallest ray of it touches you. And then you say, yes, it's my karma. I get to have this incredible opportunity to learn what I don't know. Isn't that wonderful? Because as soon as I learn it, you see, it's not my karma anymore, because it's done. It's just a field of energy and how we respond, and it shifts and it shifts. Everything that you are today is the result of all the decisions you made until right this moment. Everything that will happen to you from this moment forward is entirely determined by how you are responding now. Isn't that an extraordinary promise? Don't we want to embrace that with our whole hearts, no matter how difficult? Because the alternative is far worse, yes? So, let me ask you if you have any questions before we call it an evening. Yes, Sangeeta. Astrologically?
Indian astrology said that there is a shadowy planet Rahu. There is a shadowy planet Rahu which creates unnecessary obstacles in the path of achieving something. So while for some people, the path to achieve something is easy, while for others, it is difficult. Sudden unnecessary obstacles come. So how is karma?
Sangeeta is asking the question, in essence, how does if your horoscope, she's speaking of the shadowy planet Rahu that clouds your horoscope, and for some people achievement is easy and for others it's difficult because planetary influences and so on. Swami Kriyananda remarked once, he said, you see such and so person, he referring to someone we knew whose success seems effortless. He said, but you don't see all the incarnations in which he failed and tried again and failed and tried again and failed and tried again, and that all the forces have come together in this incarnation. It's somebody who has an effortless path has an effortless path because he's earned that effortless path. Because when faced with defeat in countless incarnations, or even in this one, he didn't give up. Your destiny is based on every decision that you've made. Now your horoscope, the science of astrology and the science of yoga are actually the same science. I'm a little bit on, I have a superficial understanding of what I'm going to say. I know it's true, but I can't explain it in detail. It's in the book Raja Yoga, which you can probably buy back there. The pattern of energy in your chakras is your karma, because it's the vrittis of energy, and we'll explain this more detail in another class. The vrittis of energy, the chakras represent the spectrum from self-realization to as ignorant as a human being can do. You store energy at the level of your own actions. Okay, each of the chakras corresponds to various of the planets. And so when you leave this physical body, in your astral body, the pattern of the chakras is still there. The chakras are in the astral body, not in the physical body. Someone who got a hysterectomy asked if they still had a second chakra. Yes, you do. You know, you can't get at it with a surgeon's knife. That's just the physical body. So that pattern is in the astral world, and a baby is born at an exact moment. I've been present at births. I'm sure many of you have also, or given birth. The baby, darn it, just won't come until the baby's going to come. And there's just the moment when the baby will be born. Because that pattern within here, the whole physical world, and this is again very hard to really get your mind around, everything in the material world is a symbol of the more subtle universe. The causal universe, the astral universe, the material world. We think the material world is the largest and operative world, but it isn't. Thought comes first, then comes energy, then it finally manifests. So when the physical body manifests at that moment of birth, it comes out in exactly the right moment, guided by the chakras, and the planets are in the position that actually correspond to the subtle energy in the chakras. So it's the chakras that cause the moment of birth. Then if the astrologer is wise, he can see the planets, and he reads in the planets the karma in the chakras. That's why if the astrologer is really good, a friend of mine, an Indian man in America, very, very successful businessman, then somebody peripherally related to his company was targeted by the US government for some kind of fraud. And then they started targeting my friend. For more than 2 years, he was absolutely assaulted by the prosecutors in the government, and they could not find a trace of dishonesty in him because he wasn't. Okay, all of that happened, is going on. His business was ruined, he lost everything. He responded well and started another company, but he lost everything in the lawsuits and the this and that. Just before this all ends, he found a horoscope that his grandfather had cast for him by an astrologer somewhere in the south of India. I think it was written in Tamil. And it said, at the age of 44, he will be persecuted by the government for 2 years, and it will stop on his birthday when he's 46. And the case was going, there looked like there was no chance. 1 week before his birthday, there was a big change, and on his birthday, it stopped. I said, who was the astrologer? You know, that's what we'd like to know. But it was just, he didn't even know it. He had to have it translated. He didn't even speak the language. Incredible. But that astrologer looked at the planets, saw how they would progress, and knew that this would happen to him at a certain point because it was in his chakras. So the planets are not causing it. The planets are a more convenient way of describing it, but it's coming from inside. However, it can all be mitigated by right attitude and the grace of God. Yogananda, there's a chapter in Autobiography of a Yogi, Outwitting the Stars. His horoscope said he was to marry 3 times. He said absolutely not. But 3 times they tried to marry him. So the karma sort of came forward, but he resisted it. And in his life, he said, he would sometimes find out the most inauspicious periods of time in which to do things and then go forward and do them. He said it would take more willpower, but it could always be overcome because nothing is stronger than our own inner destiny. So that's the answer. Astrology can be interesting, but you rule it. It doesn't rule you. Okay, any other questions?
If you have someone close to you that's dying, how do you help them start to detach themselves from you, from the environment they're familiar with?
The question is, how do you help someone who's dying detach? You can only help them as much as they're willing to be helped. That's the first thing you have to learn. You can't force people to be philosophical if they're not going to be, and often if you try to, quote, make them detach, you'll just hurt them in a way that you never want to hurt them. I think the best way to work with dying people is to just love them, and love them with the broadest, kindest kind of love that you can. My experience of being with dying people and people who are diagnosed and all that is to not be afraid. I have found that the single thing that I'm able to bring to the situation of death is that I'm not afraid of death. And I don't think it's a tragedy. I think it's wonderful. And it's a wonderful opportunity to learn new things. And I find if I just walk in and I'm not afraid of their suffering, I'm not afraid of the consequences of death, I'm not afraid that something terrible is going to happen if they don't do this, just bring that in. And that allows everybody in the situation to open up in the right way. And then pure intuition will guide you. I've really found that it really is not a good idea to bring an agenda in. Just bring a fearless, open heart, a prayer to God to be used as an instrument, and then let it unfold. And if nothing unfolds, you just stay there and just do what you can for what you can. I was with a man, they took him off of life support. So he knew that on Tuesday at 3 o'clock he was going to die. And he'd been unconscious. And then they invited me in to be there. And he was absolutely wide awake. He was a very brave man. He was totally wide awake. You know, it's 2:45. And he knows that at 3 o'clock, he was completely calm, just with his wife, just looking at her. He was suddenly diagnosed with terrible cancer, and there was just no hope for him. He didn't want to live. And just was with his wife very calmly. It was in a hospital. I was the only person in the room who wasn't completely freaked out. And they insisted on sedating him. I said, look, he's perfectly courageous. Let him die consciously. Absolutely out of the question. Because they just couldn't bear the thought of it. But I just, if you meditate at all, you're on both sides. I just felt I'll stand with him and, I'll be a force that he can follow through. There was nothing to say to anybody. I tried with that little bit of don't sedate him, and then I just said, forget it. It's not that important. Any other questions or thought? Yes.
Some questions. One is there anything, Ashaji, which is called positive karma? For example, the first 30 years of my life, I might be sinning. I might be harming someone. Not me, I'm saying an example. Like first 30 years, I've been harming someone. But the next 30 years, I do good work.
God is no tyrant.
Will that be neutralized, or will I go to the next life?
What if you're a bad person for 30 years and then the next 30 years you're a good person? Karma is mathematical. It really is mathematical. It's magnetism versus magnetism. It's how much energy you've put here versus how much energy you put here. So nobody's out to get you. So if your conversion is powerful, and the good that you put out is so powerful, I think of it like this. Karma is like a boomerang. And things don't happen instantly necessarily. Like if I'm a 12-year-old kid and I'm driving my bike and I see a 3-year-old kid on a little tricycle and I don't like them and I drive my big bike into him and I knock him to the ground, I'm strong enough to just keep going. I can outrun the consequences of that. Then, of course, that 3-year-old grows up to be a banker, and you need a loan, and you go in and you ask him for a loan, and he remembers you, and he blackballs you, and you don't get the loan. Seems really unfair, but you outran it for a while, but it caught up with you. Okay, karma is like a boomerang. You throw it like this, and it may make a really wide circle before it comes back to you, but it's tied to you if you tossed it. If in the meantime, from the time you threw it out till it comes back to you, you've learned a great deal of what you didn't know when you threw it out, then by the time it comes back to you, many things will have happened. You'll have created an atmosphere of vibrations that will sort of eat up some of that energy, that will convert some of that energy before it hits you. We talk about mitigated karma. So it's your karma to break your arm, but instead you'll just fall against the wall. It's your karma to lose all your money, but in fact just one account will go under, because the mitigating energy that you've put out acts like the atmosphere on a meteor. So some of it pings at you, but not all of it. If you even more have become a disciple of a great master, then he may realize that there's nothing for you to learn from this, and he'll put an umbrella over it and take the karma for you. Or at the very least, you won't react to it so badly because you'll understand that it's just something that's happening and I just have to work with it and I can go on. So it's just mathematical. It's force against force, energy against energy. And everything in future will improve if you start working on it now. That's the most important thing to know. Okay? I think we have used up our allotted time. I have a great loyalty to time, so if there's any other questions, I'm happy to answer them, but I think that will be the end of it. How do we do what?
How do we expiate karma?
I shouldn't catch the last. Expiate?
Karma, bad karma. Bad karma.
How do we neutral? There's no such thing. Okay. The question is about bad karma, and I'll answer that. On this planet, our definition of good is pleasurable and easy, and in conformance with our ego's preferences. That's what we call good. What we call bad is when it's not pleasurable, when it's not easy, and when it doesn't match our concepts. Okay? But a lot of what we call good is really bad because it allows us to remain exactly the same and to learn nothing, and to just sort of effortlessly slide into old age without ever having anything happen that challenges us, and we call that a good life. Or we have a life that's full of challenges that forces us to expand ourselves, to become much bigger than we were, to believe in God, and we call that bad karma. So the first thing you have to realize is that to be challenged and to have our ease and our pleasure disrupted, to have our desires disappointed, is not necessarily bad. The only thing that's bad is if instead of expanding our consciousness, we contract it. If when we're asked to become identified with a greater reality, we refuse to and identify with a smaller reality, that's bad. If we identify with a larger reality, that's good. Now, circumstances will create that. Often ease and pleasure cause us to contract and contract and contract, and so it's really bad karma. So the way we mitigate all karma is to meet it pleasantly, with calm acceptance and joy, and at all times always try to be attuned to a greater reality, whether it's easy or not. Okay? And that gets rid of bad karma because we stop calling anything bad, because it doesn't feel bad anymore. It just feels like something we have to do that's going to take a little more energy than just sitting home at night and watching television. But is that bad? Do you see? It's a lot in how we think about it. And that concept of bad karma is one of those that everybody's always chasing around. You know, it looks bad because it requires something of us. But if it's a victorious life, you know, this life goes by like that. And we're at the end of it and we look back. How did I respond to this life? That's the only good or bad question. If you responded badly, you didn't have good karma, no matter what it looked like, you see. Very important question. I'm glad you asked. You might not like the answer, but you can come back tomorrow and we can try again. Okay, that's enough for tonight. God bless you.